It's May, the lusty month of May. Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I am back to talk about the books that I read in the first half of May. It's been an interesting reading month for me, though I don't feel like I've read anything that's really blown me away this month, and that might be reflected in the books that I talk about today. So fingers crossed for me that at some point during May I really hit upon a 5-star. At the moment I feel like the main way that I am getting that feeling has been by doing rereads or re-listening to things on audiobook, but I want to get that with a new book. Come on guys. So the first book that I want to talk to you about today is Pandora's Jar, Women in the Greek Myths by Natalie Haynes. I'm a big fan of Natalie Haynes. I have previously read 1,000 Ships, which was her fiction book, and this is her latest book, her latest non-fiction offering, which really does, as it says on the tin, it is about the women in the Greek myths that we all know and love, and just putting all of the focus on these women and how they have been presented over the years, not just in the original classical myths, but also in popular culture as well, and how our perceptions of these women have changed over time. So of course we're talking about Pandora, we're talking about Jocasta, Medea, Penelope, Helen of Troy, and so many more other women. And yeah, generally I really enjoyed this. I'm very glad that I picked this up. Like I say earlier, this wasn't one that absolutely blew me away, but has been a very welcome addition to my growing Greek myth retelling collection. And I'm very excited to pick up The Children of Jocasta, which is her other fiction book that I haven't picked up yet. I think she's also got a book that's like The Ancient Guide to Modern Life, and that looks really interesting. Let me know if any of you have read that. Definitely a big recommend. I mean, it was always going to be a win for me talking about women in history, bringing Greek myths, and you know, it's great. The next book that I finished in May was The Juniper Tree by Barbara Comyns. And I don't know, I think it probably says something about this book that I don't remember much about it. It didn't really leave that much of an impression on me. It is a lot of the time quite a plotless little book, and therefore I didn't really feel much momentum whilst reading it. But it is initially about a woman who is homeless and jobless. She has an illegitimate child with a man that she only met once, who she doesn't even know the name of. And it's basically her trying to kickstart her life again, getting a job, getting a new home, cultivating a group of friends around her, and then it kind of takes a turn into being really weird. As you might be able to tell from the title, it is a retelling of the Grimm's brothers' story of the Juniper Tree. And I would say that that retelling element plays most of its part in the ending, and therefore I don't really want to delve too much into it. But as with a lot of fairy tale retellings, it is very dark and unsettling. But yeah, personally for me, I didn't find it that compelling. It had a very slow pace, and I've said in the past that I am somebody who does like a plotless, slow-paced book, or at the very least a lot of books where other people have said, oh, that had barely any plot, it was way too slow. I've often ended up liking them. I know that's something that Jane Austen is often criticised for, and I'm always like, no, you see, it seems like nothing has happened in this scene, but actually everything has happened. But I don't know, maybe I need to mentally adjust what I think of as a slow book, because this was very much so for me. I also felt like the writing style was very detached. I never felt really connected to any of these characters or their relationships to each other, and that for me is a bit of a red flag, because relationships and character and personality is so important to me in fiction. It was definitely an interesting break from my normal reads. This was a book I was actually gifted by Kieran at Katie Books, so thank you so much for this. I always love with Kieran's books that he sends to me how he always breaks me out of whatever rut that I'm currently reading. Always likes to throw me a curveball, does that Kieran. Next up is William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Mean Girls. Similarly to last month, I had The Taming of the Clueless, which was a Shakespeareanized version of the script to Clueless. Here we have the exact same thing, but with Mean Girls. 'Tis natural, methinks, that parents cry upon the day their child first goeth schoolward. Perforce this is the case most typical when children are a meagre 5 years old. I am 16, and was until today schooled by my parents in our family home. Good gentles, like a waiting open book, the contents of your mind is plain to read. A homeschooled child is the utmost rarity, and 'twere a freak one would in a circus find. Unlock thine ear, each horrible MC, there's naught at which thou art greater than me. From grades I earn to mine keen poetry, no one may lay a hand on Kevin G. A mathlete I, so yea, nerd is inferred, yet still thou must forget all thou hast heard. Forsooth, I am like Sir James Bond the Third. This Kevin likes it shaken, never stirred. The G is mute when I sneak in thy door, and satisfy thy wench upon the floor. Thou shalt be sure 'tis she that doth adore, when she doth cry, more, Kevin a poor. Oh, I love that. So yeah, as you can probably tell, a lot of joy was had with this. What I will say, if we are comparing the Clueless version to the Mean Girls one, I do personally slightly give the edge to the Clueless. Maybe it was because it was the first one that I read, but I did feel as if Clueless just slotted itself into the Shakespearean setting a lot easier, which feels a bit strange to say because you would feel like with like the machinations of Cady against the plastics, you would think you'd be able to really pull out like a Shakespearean feel in the plot. But I think part of it was that in adapting Clueless to Shakespeare, the author Ian Dushka made the decision to set his Clueless retelling actually in 16th century England, so there wasn't reference to technology, whereas this is literally just Mean Girls but with Shakespearean language. It's still very much set in the early 2000s, and I don't know, something about that just didn't quite land 100%, but still really, really good fun. If you have been interested, definitely check it out. And once again, I want to see a performance of this. In the middle of the month, I then re-listened for, I think now the 4th time, to Red, White and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. And I'm not going to rant about this too much because I've talked about it many a time. Yeah, I just needed something that was fun, something that was familiar, and yeah, did that for me. What I will say though is that this reread goes to show why it is that I do reread and re-listen to my old favourites, because I swear to God, there was a part of the political manoeuvring and the election side to the plot of Red, White and Royal Blue that I must have completely bypassed on the previous times that I've read this book. And yeah, just re-listening to it this time round really opened that up for me. So, you know, don't ever write off rereading books. You will find things that you didn't notice the first time. And then back onto the new books, I read The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim. This is a story about 4 different women from different backgrounds who have never met before, but all kind of congregate around this one medieval mansion in Italy. They all decide that they are going to rent out this house for the month of April. Basically because they're all kind of wanting to get away from their dreary lives. They're just feeling very dissatisfied and they want a chance to regroup and re-energize themselves. And this was a lovely little book. I wouldn't say it's one that's particularly stuck with me. I don't really feel like the characters or their relationships to each other have really made much of an impact on me, but it was definitely a nice one to read, and especially because a lot of people at the moment are reading books that were published between 1900 and 1950 for Katie from Books and Things readathon. This was published in 1922. Really nice to just have like a little taster of that. So what really jumped out to me when I was reading this were just generally the descriptions of these different women and how dissatisfied they are with their lives and how just mundane their lives are, and how they just kind of take it for granted that this is what their lives should be. And especially at the beginning of the book, when each of the women are making the decision that they are going to treat themselves to this holiday, you know, they're going round in circles in their minds about whether or not they are even deserving of rest. And I feel like that's something that could really speak to a lot of people. There's a part right at the beginning where one of the women is talking about how she should be giving her money to her local church, how there are so many people suffering and yet she's deciding to put the money towards a holiday, and who is she, just this one woman trying to make herself happy, and feeling like because she's just one woman compared to all of these other people, she doesn't deserve it. But I think it's a story that really goes to show that you cannot help other people until you have sorted yourself out, until you've looked after yourself, until you've given yourself that bit of self-care and self-love. And just a reminder to have a bit of self-compassion, to look after yourself, because there's a reason why on aircraft they tell you to put your own life vest on before you go and help other people. So I'm very glad for this book for reminding me of that. Then next up, I finished The Covent Garden Ladies by Hallie Rubenhold. You'll recognise Hallie Rubenhold as the author of The Five, which I know is very popular in the last couple of years. This takes us further back from that Victorian setting and transplants us instead into 18th century London. And rather than what I thought the focus was going to be, which was just going to be generally on the sex workers of Covent Garden in the 18th century, it's actually a kind of like triple biography of Samuel Derrick, Jack Harris and Charlotte Haynes. 3 people who led very interesting, complicated lives, but whose lives all brought them together to create Harris's List, the infamous Harris's List, which was an annual list detailing all of the ladies of the night of Covent Garden. Jack Harris basically being the pimp, Samuel Derrick being the writer of the list, he being a failed poet looking for work, and then Charlotte Haynes, who was a courtesan who later became a madam and started quite an enterprise running her own brothels, and basically going through these 3 different people's lives and how their lives intersected. And even though the book does kind of touch upon these different women who they employed, I do wish that there had been a bit more focus on those women. You do get right at the beginning and then right at the end a little bit of an insight into what it was like to be a sex worker in 18th century London, but not as much as I would have liked. There's not as much commentary on that. It's really focused on these 3 people. And I will warn you right now, if you like your historical figures to be sympathetic, you are not going to get it here. And I will put out the content warning for sexual assault, for rape, but also child molestation and abduction, because the ways that that these three people conspired to get women to work for them were not always the best circumstances. So yeah, definitely look out for that. But what you could never say is that these people were not interesting. They were very complex, complicated people, and you find yourself like admiring them for their tenacity and their ingenuity in business, but also thinking, wow, you just like kidnapped someone right there, didn't you? Yeah. Don't know how I feel about that. And what I would also say is this similar issue that I had with the Five, which is that I find Hallie Rubenhold's writing style just a little bit dry. It wasn't my personal favourite and sometimes kind of put me off reading it. So yeah, definitely one that I'm glad that I've read. Definitely a history that I'm really interested in, but I would have preferred there to have been focused, directed more towards the women rather than to the business figures. And like I say, I found the writing style a little bit boring, which I feel shouldn't be the case with this topic. And then finally, the last book that I read in the first half of May was my most anticipated release of this year, Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. And I'm really sorry to say I was a bit let down by this. So as I've said before, this story retells the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, but from the perspective of Ariadne, who was the daughter of Minos, the half-sister to the Minotaur, who ended up helping Theseus to fight against the Minotaur, win and escape from Crete. She helps him after falling head over heels in love with him, and they end up escaping together. However, if you know the story of Theseus and Ariadne, you'll know that doesn't treat her very well. It does not end very well. And as I said in my book haul, I had actually never heard of Ariadne before I listened to Heroes by Stephen Fry. I knew the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, but I didn't know about Ariadne's part in that. So since then, I've been really intrigued by her story. And when I found out that this was coming out, I was like, perfect timing. It's definitely a perspective that I think is warranted, one that we needed to have. And I definitely feel like the first 100 pages of this are really gripping. And at the beginning, especially, I thought it was a lot more faster paced than I thought it was going to be. The entire story that I knew of Theseus and the Minotaur and Ariadne basically was over by that first 100 pages. And I was kind of like, okay, what are we going to do with the other 250 pages? Something that I also liked that isn't really mentioned anywhere in like the blurb of this book, in the plot synopsis, is that yes, we are looking at the life of Ariadne, but we're also looking at the life of her sister Phaedra, her little sister who didn't end up escaping with her. And once again, I don't want to go too much in detail into what happens to Phaedra because I don't want to spoil things too much for you, as much as you can spoil Greek myths that have been around for thousands of years. But I don't know, some people might consider it a spoiler. But what I will say is that after we've gotten out of the main narrative that I was thinking that we were going to focus on, we get to part 2, and from part 2 onwards in this book, the narrative splits. Part of the narrative being spent with Ariadne and then part of it being spent with Phaedra and seeing the aftermath of Ariadne's escape from Crete. And I thought that was really interesting, kind of delving into this sisterly dynamic and their relationship to each other and how things change over time. So I was generally really enjoying it, and then I got to around about like the 200 page mark, and then things just started to go a little bit downhill for me. Not in the sense that I thought it was bad, but I just, I had issues with some of the pacing and just generally with the way that Jennifer Saint chose to tell this story. It feels very trite to say that it was very telly rather than showy, but I think if you read this, you'll kind of feel like you're being hit over the head with so many different stories, with different figures of this mythology kind of plopping you down and then telling you their life story in a way that feels a little bit unnatural. And also because this story is just generally told in this kind of style where everything just seems inevitable. Ariadne is kind of talking to you about what happened to her life from the perspective of knowing what happened. It's definitely not being told from a present tense. So I felt like she would often gloss over aspects of the story that I felt needed a little bit more fleshing out. So like her relationship with Theseus and why she falls in love with him. That's something that I feel like should have had a little bit more time to develop. But because Jennifer Saint chooses to tell this story in a kind of way of, oh, it's inevitable, of course I was going to fall in love with him. She just kind of has like this insta-love like that. And I did generally feel like a lot of the relationships in this book were very one note. There wasn't much depth to them. And I don't know if that's Jennifer Saint kind of making a commentary on the myths, but it did kind of feel like all of these characters were just together for the reasons of, well, it's inevitable, that's just the story that we know, rather than her really working to make these characters dynamic on their own. I think the character that was the most interesting and dynamic to me was Phaedra, and then she kind of takes a bit of a nosedive towards the end of the book. And once again, if you know the story of Phaedra, what happens to her, you'll kind of see what's coming. But I felt like Jennifer Saint should have done a little bit more to make that change, that transition, feel warranted, rather than just, that's just what happens in the story, so we're gonna have it happen. I just didn't feel like the way she told it was very narratively satisfying. A lot of the ending just felt a little bit like contrivance to get us to the end point that we know it should get to. I don't know if that made any sense at all. I'm very tired right now. So yeah, if we're kind of going by like star ratings, I wouldn't mark it super low down. I'd probably give it like a 3 star. So definitely one, if you've been interested in it, then pick it up. but I'm not going to give it like a massive glowing recommendation. However, of course, I'm going to give the cover and the end papers, that gets 10 out of 10. This is the most beautiful thing I own right now. So yes, those were all of the books that I read in the first half of May. Do let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought about them, and also any other books that you've read this month that you want to recommend. Do let me know. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.